Everybody hands up また明日のヒーローズ come back 頭上数え指折るカウンダウン行くぜ3、2、1 make some noise.
Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, and after breaking down Kuwabara's greatness months ago, it only makes sense to now tackle everybody's favorite demon pair. You could make the case that they both deserve their own videos, but while writing and thinking through this script, it began to make more sense to me to discuss both of them in tandem. So, with all that said, let's start with how they were both introduced and break down that scene in greater detail. After Yusuke becomes Spirit Detective, his first real job is stopping a demon trio who have stolen some very valuable artifacts. But here's the interesting part about how Hiei, Kurama, and Goki are set up in relation to each other. Hiei is clearly presented as the one calling the shots. He even developed a plan for how to use the stolen items. Goki is pretty much your prototypical large, imposing, but not really all that challenging tough guy. Pretty standard in shonen, and the perfect first test of Yusuke's new spirit abilities. What it also proves early on is that despite his aversion to schooling, Yusuke has an exceptional head for battle. Goki, of course, is not very important in the grand scheme of things, but think about the interaction Hiei and Kurama have before he fights. Hiei carries himself like the strongest member there, and yet, Kurama refuses to take part in his plans and simply walks away. Hiei escapes too, but likely never confronts Kurama about his decision. Hiei explains why several episodes later at Mei's castle. He chose Kurama to be on his team so he would never ever have to face him. Kurama is by far the least outwardly aggressive of the bunch, and on top of that, Kurama was developed in his first Focus episode not by fighting Yusuke, which he never actually does, but by saving his human mother. And yet, Hiei of all people, the guy that nearly killed Yusuke, and for a hot second considered flat out killing everyone else too, is not just talking up Kurama's killer instinct, but emphasizing how Kurama is far more dangerous than he could ever hope to be. The reason I highlight those moments is because Yu Yu Hakusho is a master when it comes to subtle, methodical character development, even in the earliest stages. And while Hiei and Kurama aren't as focused on as Yusuke, there is a patient and tempered way the show goes about peeling back each of their multiple layers. And we'll start by peeling back Hiei. Hiei embraces the kind of character traits that simply need to be in any shonen anime. But the best part about this show's characters is who they prove to be underneath whatever people see them as initially. In Hiei's case, he would immediately strike you as a very cunning and sinister antagonist, and he does show that. But, just like Kuwabara, Hiei has his own code. One of my favorite pieces of Hiei dialogue is at the Dark Tournament. Kuwabara is understandably spooked because Hiei can do this. Hiei has more or less renounced his criminal ways by this point, but since Kuwabara is always at odds with him, he now believes that if he pisses off Hiei too much, goodbye Kuwabara. A lot of characters like Hiei would just playfully scoff at the idea of friendly fire, or even attempt to reaffirm their evil ways, even though we all pretty much know they probably won't betray everyone now. Like when Piccolo was still adamant about being evil halfway through the Android saga, and Krillin saw right through that act. Here's what I love about Hiei. He makes a point to shut down any and all theories that he would dragon up and kill his teammates first, and then playfully scoffs at the idea of friendly fire. Hiei cares. He almost never shows it directly because that's who he is, but even Kuwabara could tell that there was more to him than his constant put-downs, and this development doesn't come out of left field. Hiei's small gestures before and after his fight at Mei's castle, as Kurama indicates, was the team growing on him, the team having an effect on him. And even before that moment, as I touched on, we had a much less subtle test of Hiei's loyalty. Regardless of his perceived or actual misgivings, Hiei is as honorable and compassionate a fighter as anyone on his team below the surface, which also made his confrontation with Yusuke prior to the Sensui Showdown so fitting, because given those points, who better than Hiei to inform Yusuke that the man he'll be fighting next only wants him dead? The same man that tricked a child into stalling for time, knowing that he'd probably die, thus weakening Koenma who would be forced to revive him. Compassion? Honor? Not part of Sensui's game plan. But what really brings it all together is his unique relationship with his sister. Hiei denies getting the Jigan Eye to watch over Yukina, and originally that wasn't the reason he obtained it, but it soon became the reason. The most interesting thing about that, however, is why he chooses not to reveal himself to her. He did have an agreement with Shigure to never tell her, but Hiei's mind was clearly made up before that deal was struck, so it runs much deeper than that. It probably wouldn't be all that surprising to Yukina, since she knows her brother is a fighter, ergo why she was at the Dark Tournament. And she'd probably be happier about it too, given that her brother is someone from the team she spent a fair part of the Dark Tournament cheering for, the same team that rescued her before said tournament started. But Hiei keeps it a secret, because he's a criminal. Or at least, that's what he says. But the other reason he chooses this, and perhaps the bigger reason, is because he's an orphan. As the series goes on, Hiei does a lot to at least try to make up for his old ways, including an undefeated Dark Tournament record. He's certainly not the same demon criminal he used to be, but he'll always be an Amiko. He'll always be the child of fire that his people didn't want. And as a result, despite fighting for the side of good now, Hiei still sees himself as unfitting of that relationship, or even just relationships, because Hiei's people kept her, but abandoned him. That was his first memory, and likely his most potent one. And even before Hiei knew about Yukina, he acted in ways that drove people away from him. I honestly think that Hiei is afraid. Even though Yukina is one of the more amicable characters on the show, I think Hiei fears the slightest possibility of Yukina being ashamed of him if he reaches out to her, which would then force Hiei into reliving his first memory all over again. That might not be the case, but given what we know and learn about Hiei, it makes sense as a potent motivator to not tell her the truth, but still protect her in his own way. Hiei once said that while his third eye might not be natural, it does give him exactly what he needs. Yes, it does. And finally, let's touch on Hiei's relationship with Kuwabara. Both of them have their own sense of honor and follow a unique code, but both of them realize, although less overtly with Hiei of course, that they actually have a fair bit in common. There is a reason that Hiei does not mind that Kuwabara is into his sister, who he is very protective of. Maybe it's because Hiei thinks Kuwabara is too dim-witted to pose a threat, but I think it's more than that. Hiei watched the same Kuwabara fights we did, including this one, so he knows that if it really came down to it, Kuwabara might just be able to keep his sister safe. That would also explain why he's so harsh on Kuwabara, but still relatively trusting of him. Hiei can't watch over Yukina forever, nor should he, quite honestly, but perhaps someday, Kuwabara can. Hiei is a great character because almost all of his growth is internalized. Even though his mannerisms don't go through any drastic overhauls over the course of the series, his perspective does. And even though Hiei is so totally over this whole save the world thing by the time Sensui rolls around, Yusuke is still fully convinced that he'll be there when he's needed. Yusuke was right. Now, let's segue to Kurama, a character who, unlike Hiei, is first classified as the demon with the biggest heart. But everything we learn about him prior to Yoko's return informs us that there's something of a duality to him, which is symbolized by his two names. He can care for his mother one day as Tsuichi and destroy opponents the next as Kurama without even so much as a change in mood. And there's an interesting contrast to the way he fights compared to the others. Hiei and Kuwabara are always a little bit overconfident and vocal in their own ways, especially when they think the fight is won. Yusuke is a little more snarky with his commentary and is almost always pissed off, which fuels a lot of his power. It's actually more complicated than that, but for another time. Kurama, however, is a fighter that is all about control, strategy, and utilizing the field around him. Basically a fusion of Gaara and Shikamaru with added hair. He's never too up or too down, unlike most of his cohorts, and unless his opponents have a decidedly unfair advantage, you'd put your chips on him every single time, and sometimes he wins in spite of that. And eventually, even his fighting develops its own duality, creating a third identity. Before Yoko was unintentionally brought back, even a nearly dying Kurama was still calm and under control for the most part, still thinking of his next move even while bleeding out. But during the late stages of the Dark Tournament, he relies more on Yoko. Yoko's rougher voice and decided lack of much outward compassion, among other things, makes him antithetical to Kurama in several respects. But then, the show uses that duality in a beautiful way, as directly opposed to just giving Kurama a super form. They use that internal struggle as a way to eventually resolve him as a character. With mission after mission raising the stakes, Yoko naturally becomes a more prominent figure, and it changes Kurama to have to keep going down that hole, which is made very apparent when he's forced to kill a child. Yoko obviously wasn't the one responsible, it was more on Sensui than anything, but this event functions as a metaphor for the kind of person Kurama doesn't want to be. The kind of person who feels like his actions are always justified regardless of cost. He's shaken up about it because of the cost, but I also think, in the back of his mind, he thinks this is exactly what Yoko would have done, and without a second thought. And then, in his very next fight, his normal strategy changes from waiting around and thinking things through to this fight was over before it ever started. Suffer forever, Taguro. It's so fitting that this development comes right before the Three Kings arc, because it's there where Kurama has to confront his past through Yomi. At this point, Kurama as a character is defined by living in two worlds with three identities. A character whose past at times feels at odds with his present and the people thereof. The show poetically captures that contrast by having Kurama call his mother and assure her that everything is alright while in the middle of a hellhole. This represented the pinnacle of his growing need to look to his past for answers while also being stretched thin by his present. But, in time, he realized that where he should actually be looking is his future. Through his friends, his family, and his many adventures, Kurama learns how to be human, and in doing so, learns how to leave Yoko behind. Hiei and Kurama are both great and interesting characters because of the methodical way the show allows them to progress and understand themselves, which, in turn, allows us to understand them through every step of the journey. In a show about elevating your power levels, there's a lot of attention paid to the mindsets, to the psychology of the characters, and through mostly subtle methods, the character growth the demon pair gets is just as well done as anything else in the series. The reason I wanted to discuss them together is because there's an interesting reverse parallel that defines each of their paths from entry to finale. In Hiei's case, his initial perception is being constantly shattered by his genuine honor and growing attachment to the others. He still puts on his brooding loner routine because that's how he grew up, but over time, he's able to place his trust in others who showed him kindness, even when he himself was anything but kind. In many ways, the theme song speaks to Hiei as a character just as much as anyone, because Hiei began his life isolated, but he does in time open himself up a little. Yusuke only knew Hiei initially as the guy he arrested once when he joins the team, so Yusuke's trust towards him kind of fits the role of the compassionate stranger that Sarah White sings about in the OP, the kindness from people Hiei doesn't really know yet, and I'd argue that it definitely wakes him up, so to speak. And even though he never really had that singular defining moment of truly embracing the others, he never really needed it, although one could argue that his heightened emotions against Sensui might count. But, for the most part, he had a handful of smaller, more controlled moments that fall in line with his character. And more than that, he was okay with how things ended up. He found his own closure for his past and his present. So while he ends the show still isolated in his own way, both Hiei and the friends he's made know for a fact that he never ever has to be again. And, if they should need him, well, you know the rest. With Kurama, it's less about opening up and more about eventually closing down through becoming closer to Yoko. Hiei made it very, very clear, very early, that Kurama is not to be trifled with, and that's because if he ever dropped that human side completely, very few people would be able to stop him. Hiei was stripped of all connections to start, but as a born-again human, Kurama begins life with a mother who he grows very fond of, enough to risk his own life to save hers, both because of and in spite of his demon side. Hiei becomes more trusting of others as the story goes on, but Kurama becomes less trusting of himself when he relies more on Yoko to resolve confrontations. His fear in the Dark Tournament eventually led to anger one arc later, maybe even a little bit of self-hate. But since he's not a Sith Lord, he never let it go any further than that, and instead broke the cycle by choosing his own path. And fittingly enough, Hiei only used his full demon form once, very early on, and a lot of his screen time after the fact humanizes him more than anything, but Kurama only uses it later, making him much stronger, but at a cost. While their paths diverge heavily, both of them end up in similar places. Both of them resolve as characters by coming to terms of who they are, who they were, and what the people around them now mean. Both of them chose humanity over their demon heritage because they found something in Living World that they couldn't find back home. They found love, they found compassion, they found people they could trust. And even though Hiei would never openly admit to any of that, Kurama says it best. Yusuke might be the first and only human Hiei is willing to die for. In closing, Yu Hakusho prides itself on amazing fights, great villains, and zero filler. But the most interesting part to me is how every main character feels like they're right where they need to be when it's all said and done. Individually, the team boasts really good characters, with interesting powers, distinct personas, and perfect voice acting. But together, this cast of colorful characters brought out the best in each other. A cast that made you feel all the feels when it was time to say goodbye. A team that turned individually good characters into great ones. And as always, thanks for watching.